listening to Spill the Tea, a podcast by Penang Institute. My name is Bamei Ting. Now, on this special episode leading to Malaysia's 15th general election, we'd like to look back at the nation's first generation of leaders, most of whom are no longer around but whose legacies remain with us today. One such individual is Tun Dr. Ismail Abdul Rahman, Malaysia's second Deputy Prime Minister. Tun Dr. Ismail played a pivotal role in the shaping of the nation but is often overlooked by later generations due to the fact that he was always either the number 2 or number 3 man in the country, and hence did not get as much text space in our history textbooks. It is also fitting that we are recording this episode on the 4th of November 2022, which would have been Tun Dr. Ismail's 107th birthday. And to help us figure out this fascinating man and his generation of leaders, we have Ooi Kee Beng, Executive Director of Penang Institute and the author of the award-winning The Reluctant Politician, Tun Dr. Ismail and His Time, which reintroduced Tun Dr. Ismail back to a new generation of Malaysians in 2006. Hello, Kee Beng. Welcome to the show.
Hello, Mei Ting. Thanks for having me.
Thank you. So, I was just thinking, in the last 6 years, we have had 4 different prime ministers. So, what do you think tends to be missing in today's leaders compared to the first generation of the nation's builders like Tun Dr. Ismail?
That's a key question, really, when we talk about leadership in Malaysia. We should definitely, everyone, compare the first generation to the present generation, not so much to criticize anyone, but to see why there is such a difference in what we would call leadership.
Mm-hmm.
And now, I've been fascinated by that group of leaders from the earlier times. You know, it could either be from Singapore or Malaysia. Because I found them, I was born just at the tail end of it, right? I was born just before independence came to Malaysia. And so even as a young man, I was fascinated by these characters, this first generation of leaders, because I taught them to have certain characteristics that was disappearing very quickly. Now, to be somewhat nasty about it, I could say that all of these were born before Malaysia. So they were not Malaysians in that sense. They were born under another time. They lived through the Japanese occupation. They lived in the colonial system, the good and bad of it. And so they had what makes a leader, and this is my main point maybe for today, is that a leader sort of knows what he wants.
Right.
Perhaps vaguely, but he knows what he wants, and so he spends his time strategizing how to get what he wants. And to get there, he has to know the world as it is in a very, very honest, clear-eyed manner. And then after that, you strategize, short-term, long-term, medium-term, and then you go for it. And I think the first generation of leaders, because they grew up in the 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, they had a clearer idea about what needed doing, or the world was in such flux that they needed to build something stable out of that. And
Right.
That's what we call, in a very, very generic way, nation building, right? So these people, and you will notice the leaders of those time, it could be even Tun Mahathir. I think he was of that period, but I think Tun Dr. Ismail was very right in the middle of it, born in just when the First World War was starting.
Mm-hmm.
So you go through that period when the colonialists were having trouble, and then the Japanese came, and so on and so forth. So this was a world in flux, and you could see that you needed a new world was coming into being. And if you were one of the elite, if you were one of the few who were highly educated, you would almost necessarily begin to think, how can I make
the world a better place?
Contribute to a world that can be stable, and so on and so forth, right? And so nationalism in that sense was a given thing in this part of the world. It was nothing bad in our mind.
Mm-hmm.
I think in the West, nationalism was a bad thing back then. While over here we think of it as something rather good because the situation was different. And so I think the first generation of leaders Of course, there's a wide variety of them, no doubt. But I think there is always that sense that someone has to do something about this.
Right.
And we've compared that to the present bunch of leaders. I think we've come to a point where too much is taken for granted. You don't have to look into the future. Even if you want to be a leader of Malaysia, you don't even have to look to the future. Nation building along the way, in that sense, stopped. Mm-hmm. And I think if you look at the recent leaders, that is what's missing. What's your plan for Malaysia? What Malaysia do you want? How are you contributing through your morality, through your example, to how this country is supposed to be, how are Malaysians supposed to be acting? And so, more than ever, we need to look back to our first generation. And like you said, Tun Dr. Ismail was in the middle of that. He was number 2 or number 3 all the time. Meaning also that the first leaders, the Tunku and Raza, they depended a lot on him, on this guy. Yeah. So he's interesting in that sense, the same way that Dr. Goh Keng Swee was important to Lee Kuan Yew in Singapore. Yeah. Look at the number 2, and then you can know who the number 1 is.
Yeah.
In a way, right?
Yeah.
And of course, after the book was written, I'm glad I wrote that book, mainly because he died so early.
Right,
and given our political culture, if you die early, you get forgotten.
Unfortunately,
right?
Yes.
That's how it is. And
that's
so
true.
I think and with this book, I think he came back into Malaysian consciousness. For that, I'm very happy about. I could mention one incident just after the book came out. A young UMNO member from Johor, Wan Faisal, I hope he's listening somewhere. He came to look me up, carrying a copy of the book, and he says, "Dr. Ooi, this is how we're going to change Malaysia." This is an UMNO man, right? And already back then, 2006, it was being felt already by young UMNO people that Malaysia was suffering a leadership problem.
Yeah.
And now, how many years on, we're still stuck in that. How do we get out of this? Now, what I find fascinating at the moment about Malaysian politics is that whatever one thinks, the Reformasi movement that started in 1998, that had great consequences for what leadership should be about in Malaysia. And I think we should see this discussion we're having today as part of that there's a new generation of Malaysians, at least 2 generations, now that the Muda movement is up, who are thinking differently. They do realize that there has to be a nation-building project, which got lost along the way, which got overshadowed by the Malay agenda and so on and so forth. So even young Malays are saying this won't do.
Yeah.
We no longer have a nation-building project. Really, right?
Yeah.
And so in that sense, Tun Dr. Ismail becomes very important for people to look at, just to remind ourselves that we've forgotten this. We once had good leaders.
That's right, yeah. And I'm glad that I read your book, and because I remember back then when I was in school, and there were always these pictures in our history textbooks, right? Of, who is who, but the focus has always been on Tunku Abdul Rahman, right? And then, there are pictures of important meetings, and then you'll be wondering, who's this guy sitting beside him? And that is so unfortunate because Tun Dr. Ismail hardly gets any attention in our national history textbooks.
Yeah, that's true. I think it's also part of our journalism, our I would say the vestiges of feudalism in our thinking.
Right.
And I think our journalism suffers from it until today, more than ever, I would say, where nothing important happens unless there's a political figure in front of that, which is silly. It does shows that some things we haven't freed ourselves. Merdeka hasn't really hit at the individual level. Yep. Merdeka for me is about the freeing of the individual Malaysian. It's not about the freeing of parties
Okay.
or politicians or simply the changing of leaders. It's about the Malaysian becoming a citizen of the world with the confidence of being a citizen in the world. We're not getting there. Why? Because we're so obsessed with a rather toxic style of nation building that we have. One, I think conceptually, perhaps we should have been thinking all the time about federation building. Malaysia is a federation. And somehow when we go into nation building, we get into the idea of identity, because nation is about identity, right? And so you get caught up in language problems and ethnicities and so on and so forth. If we had focused more on federation building, meaning building of institutions and laws and regulations and so on, more state building, as it were, but of the federal system, I think a lot of our problems might have been avoided, or at least our politics wouldn't have been so divisive, so toxic. That's where we are at the moment. We don't know how to get out of campaigning without attacking the other side for moral reasons, instead of being more focused on policy. For all the faults of the Reformasi movement, I think that discourse has started. So the last 20 years, I'm one of those who are still optimistic. The last 20 years, if we're not to focus on individual events, a lot of changes have come over the last 20 years. Not many years ago, it was unthinkable that UMNO would lose power.
Right, that's true.
And just a few years ago, people started talking about possibility of DAP and UMNO working together. That was unthinkable a while ago, but people forget very quickly that we're now talking like this.
Yeah.
And we now have many Malay parties, which I think is a sign. It's not of merely division of the Malay voter that like UMNO likes to talk about. It's a maturing and a diversifying of Malay culture in modern life. It's not a simple urban-rural divide. It's much, much more than that. People are more diverse now. They know the world in different ways, and so you expect diversity in thinking and so on, and that leads to many parties breaking off because trust in one leader or one party is no longer sustainable.
That's right, yeah.
So all that is positive. We are at the point where we don't know where Malaysia is going. We do need a new narrative. We talk about reset and all that, but it all boils down to this: that when and where did we lose this idea of building Malaysia?
Right.
And building Malaysia as Malaysia, not always introverted about, where we are more concerned about our neighbors rather than about our neighboring nations, neighboring countries. We live in a world that at some level competes all the time. All the countries compete with each other at some level. All the economies compete at some level with each other. That's what we should be looking at. But we are more concerned about local politics, as if the world has no consequence for us. And that's where we're losing out.
Yeah, that's very unfortunate. But coming back to Tun Dr. Ismail,
Yes.
And what you have just mentioned just now, I was just thinking that, it's interesting that he was the only leader in his generation who did not actually study in England. I mean, Tunku was in Cambridge.
Yeah.
Most of them were studying in England, but Tun Dr. Ismail, he was studying in Australia. He was studying medicine in Australia. And because Australia is a largely egalitarian.
Their discourse is more egalitarian.
That's right. Yeah.
Definitely.
So, was it this early years as a young man, as a young Malay man in Melbourne, which shaped the type of leader he eventually became?
Good question. I think it's one should look at the early years of any leader, right?
Right.
Partly as an individual and what the person went through, but partly what situation he then goes into as he goes back into the environment where he's going to function as a leader. So Tun Dr. Ismail is interesting in that sense. Yes, he was the first Malay to become a doctor in Australia. And what's interesting about him here, I'll bring up 2 or 3 points. One was that he always knew he had a heart problem.
Right.
And so he was always very keen on keeping his body fit. So Australia gave him that chance to always be walking out in the outback and so on and so forth, to keep the rest of his body always fit.
Yep.
That's one thing about him. And I personally think that for people who to do that in isolation, of course, you do a lot of lonely walks and so on.
Yeah.
It's character building. You get to know yourself. You get to think alone. You get to be in nature. You get that affects you. And if you do it regularly and over a long period, like he probably did when he would live there, that makes you a rather contemplative person.
Right.
And you want that in a leader, right? That's the first thing you want of anyone who's going to become a leader, that he is contemplative. So I think he was naturally contemplative. But just when he graduated as a doctor, the war had started.
Yep.
The Japanese had occupied Malaya, and so he didn't come back. So he worked for 5 years, I think, in Australia. Back in those days, in the 40s, as a young Malay man, probably the only Malay man working there, maybe the only Malaysian working at that hospital. That exposure, I think, is really important. It would have given him insights about what the larger world looks like, where is the role of someone from the third world, what is needed, and a lot of his maybe strategizing and his role in the world would have been formed back then. So when he came back to Malaysia to work as a doctor, he didn't do that very long. He very quickly got sucked into the politics of the times. So he rose to the occasion, if you like, right? And he immediately played a very big role in Malaysian politics. He and his brother Sulaiman were practically instrumental in getting Tun Abdul Rahman to take over UMNO, and so on and so forth. And the rest one can read about in the book. So his persistence and his sense of principle, I think that was obvious to people who came to work with him. He wasn't a funny man.
No, he
too
was
serious a person in many's eyes, right? And you need a number two like that to keep you on track, right?
Yeah.
And so I think he played that role very importantly. And I think he remains that kind of ideal for a lot of people who would care to read about him, right? So yes, the character of the person is important, who you meet once you get into the act, and how you rise to it, and so on and so forth. He decided to pull out of government in the mid-60s. We cannot be totally sure about why he did it. It could be partly because of his health, partly he was dissatisfied with certain things. But then he came back after the rioting of 1969. Probably, and he was a sick man.
Yeah.
He knew he was a sick man. But he felt he had to come back. He was the only one who could command the Home Ministry the way that was needed after the rioting. And those who lived through that period, they tend to have mixed feelings about him. I mean, if you're the Home Minister, you're not there to be popular, unlike today. Today, I think it's sort of a step towards a top position, right? But back then, I think the Home Minister was someone who has to take all the blows, who has to do all the things no one else wants to do, right? You're the one who had to implement the ISA and so on. And I think he mentioned very often in his private papers about how difficult that was. And he had to take every case as if he were a lawyer. Every case he should look at seriously because it affected a lot of people. If you're going to jail someone, so on and so forth. And in the end, his own idea was that he did do a good enough job. He was fair enough and so on. One thing interesting about him in today's context, now there's a place in his private papers when he was the ambassador to the UN and to the US. Once he got there, he was, of course, buying insurance for his family, and the American insurance agent advised him to not talk about his weak heart to the insurance doctor. Yeah, and his comment is interesting, which to Malaysians today seems really out of place and very un-Malaysian. He was shocked and he said, well, from this I learned that I better be careful when I deal with these Americans. You don't expect that of Malaysian politicians today to react that way, right?
Yeah.
But then I think to be fair, I think we have to think that back then, no doubt he was a Malaysian, but at that point he was a diplomat, right? He was,
Right, yeah.
and also rather technocratic by nature. That's one thing. And then, of course, there are other cases where he just couldn't stand any form of corruption. And he understood corruption even in very minute things, because corruption doesn't creep up on you. It's something you develop over time by bending the rules, by so on and so forth. So there is this event where a Chinese couple, some farmers, I think, which was the thing to do back then and even now, more now, where you thought you would just be nice to your neighborhood politician and you bring gifts, So they turned up at his door with gifts of vegetables and so. He angrily chased them away, right? Now this is almost, well, it's practically Malaysian culture to give little things to people.
That's right. Yeah.
But for him, maybe because of his Australian training or whatever, he could see that corruption starts with little things. You bend the rules and then you bend the rules and then you bend the rules and soon there's no straight line anymore. So that's interesting about him, and I think he was conscious of that in himself and in others. And so to keep to the straight and narrow, you better always keep to the straight and narrow.
Yeah, and so and on that, let me just quote Robert Kwok from your book. In describing Tun Dr. Ismail, he said that he was a man who stood by principles. He was a stickler for fair play and correctness, and asking him to use his political power to help you was tantamount to asking to be put in jail. Tun Dr. Ismail was also broadly considered a man of formidable reputation for integrity and talent in all communities, with views more cautious and more sophisticated than those of his younger colleagues. Now, these descriptions of Tun Dr. Ismail show that he was a man of principle, as you mentioned just now, and this is something arguably rather rare these days, isn't it?
Sadly, yes, but I do think that there are new politicians out there who should be given a chance. They do show promise. Some of them have been in it for a long time now. Those who started with the Reformasi, they've been at it for 20 years. And some of them have still been able to retain a reputation of being reliable and so on and so forth, and dedicated. Now, the interesting thing about Tun Dr. Ismail, when I was working on the book, helped by his son Taufik, greatly, I have to be very grateful to him for all that. And I got to interview a lot of very interesting people, among others Robert Kwok, who taught the world of Tun Dr. Ismail. They were very good friends at the end of their life, of Ismail's life. I got to interview Lee Kuan Yew on that, and perhaps here I should mention Lee Kuan Yew did say that the only Malayan politician he trusted was Tun Dr. Ismail. Now, that is quite something to hear from definitely. Lee Kuan Yew, who not the kind who would easily trust people. So that is a good compliment on Tun Dr. Ismail's character. From Tun Dr. Ismail's side, I think he didn't always find Lee Kuan Yew that easy to deal with, right? But I'm sure they had mutual respect and so on and so forth.
So earlier you were saying that Tun Dr. Ismail actually had a heart condition and other health issues. I think that must have made it very difficult for him because he was a doctor himself. So then, like you mentioned, he did all the exercises, the hiking, the swimming, the golfing, because he knew that without health, one can't do anything else.
Exactly.
Yeah, so it was definitely this discipline of his, right? Which translated to the way he worked as a leader.
Well, personally, I tend to think that discipline is rather physical.
Mm-hmm.
So people, it actually could be the easy way to gain discipline, self-discipline. You discipline yourself physically,
Yeah.
right? And that way you gain a strong sense of physical being, from which you gain a strong sense of self and social confidence, and you trust your own ability to think because you've had time while doing all this disciplining to
Alone
think
as well.
for yourself and so on. I think that's quite important to anyone who wants to lead. And also anyone who wants to lead, I think, must have some imagination.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, an ability to think ahead,
Yeah.
to think short term, long term, medium term, all that. Now, one important thing about Ismail also was that when he was called back by Tun Razak in 1969 to be the Home Affairs Minister and then Deputy as well, what was unknown to people was that both of them were dying,
sick,
and they both
yeah.
knew that. So if we have now, when we now know this, we have to look back at that period, and when the NEP was formed, it was being formulated by two leaders who knew they were dying. They just didn't know who was going first.
Yeah.
The assumption was that Razak would go first because he had leukemia, but as it turned out, it was the other way around. So one could say that Malaysian history would have been different if the other had survived, for example. But there's all that speculative. But one important thing we should remember was that when the NEP was put into place, and I, for one, think that the second Malaysia plan was actually quite a commendable one, a clever, serious document that we later called the NEP, and today we think badly of that. It could be because it was very clear in Tun Dr. Ismail's words that this experiment must not go on too long.
That's right.
Because then you're going to get a racist regime.
Yeah.
So they put 20 years on it.
Mm.
So technically, the NEP did end 1990, but of course, there was always that fear that now, if Razak or Ismail had lived until 1990, perhaps they wouldn't have that perspective. They would have that imagination. They would know of this as an experiment that needed to be done. No other country had done this, and so on and so forth. They would have then come up with another plan, and so on.
Yeah.
But as it turned out, in reality, 1990, Tun Dr. Mahathir was Prime Minister, and he did put something else into place. And we do see that in the 90s, there was a shift in the discourse, not a total shift away from NEP thinking. But I think we were helped by the fact that the Asian dragons were all flying, and Malaysia was part of it, and Japan was a great help in all of that. And so the 1990s, I think, when we look back, was a time when interracial relations were at their best.
Yeah.
Because we were growing, the economics of it were very good. So maybe back to something that other nation builders have always talked about, the primacy of economics. You get the economics right, then the rest will follow. And I think that was also part of the NEP's idea.
The whole idea of the NEP.
You get rid of poverty, and you get rid of too much racial thinking in the professions, right?
Yeah.
And I think we did succeed to some extent, but in other areas it went the other way.
That's right, yeah.
So today it's still here. The plural society thing is still here. I tend to think nowadays that maybe plural society is not such a bad thing. Maybe it's unavoidable. It's other things that one has to look at. As a smaller income gap is more important than thinking about race and profession, perhaps. It's quite natural for any society, for any human being, that in the end, at large and as a collective, work closer to people who are culturally closer to you. That one shouldn't take away from people, because that's really impossible. It's down to the income gap. It's more about that, I think. So if you ask me, going forward, social democratic measures are obviously needed today, post-Cold War and all that. But, and I think if I go into a general statement about world politics, I think after the Cold War, the sad thing about that is that social democratic thinking was also swept away in many cases because people saw it as a balancing between communism and capitalism. It shouldn't be seen that way. I think it should be seen as something quite necessary, especially today now, after 30 years after the Cold War ended. We do see the income gap becoming ridiculous.
Yep.
And so if that is not fixed, then I don't think you're going to get harmonious development in the world. Now I know I'm going off subject somewhat, but I think for leaders to really lead, they have to think and imagine and strategize, and they have to work out quite early on what their role actually is.
Okay.
What are you leading? Why are you leading? Who are you leading? Who are you responsible to, and so on and so forth. To lead and not have this, you're not a leader, you're just a populist.
Right, yeah. And, well, politics nowadays, I mean, it shouldn't be this way, but it's more like a popularity contest.
A weakness in democracy, yeah.
Yes, exactly. It should not be like this. It should, in fact, be the other way round.
So you cannot let democratic processes run wild. If you let it run wild, it tends towards populism. And when I was reading about democracy back in university, one thing that I thought central to democratic thinking is regard for the minorities. You must have that. Otherwise, democracy is just the dictatorship of the majority. Majoritarianism, if you like. That's one. Second thing is democracy is a work in progress. It must build on the population getting more and more educated in democratic matters and so on and so forth. Democratism, if you like. That would be my word for it. So democracy is more than just the vote. Democracy is meant to make each individual conscious of his agency and so on and so forth. He is not someone to be manipulated. His vote matters. His vote is an expression of his personality. That's how the voter should see himself, and that a democracy, a properly functioning democracy, should work towards making sure a citizen, through the school system or whatever system, that individual, that voter, thinks of himself as a very important person in the citizenry. And if you see a party or a government not working through that, then you know that government is not really
Then
democratic
there is a
in
huge issue.
in its convictions.
Yep. Yeah. So to wrap up, just one last question. What do you think are the qualities of a good leader?
Well, first one, I said that he should think of the very great responsibility of being a leader, and he has to work out for himself what is it he's leading people towards. What is his role here? He has to rise above self. Not always, but the role demands
most
that,
of
right?
the time, yeah.
As some people would say, when you lead, you can't be popular with everybody. You just do what you think you need to do. And then you need guts in that sense, right?
Yeah.
But I think you need imagination. People without imagination, when they lead, you see that it becomes a matter of pride. If they made a public decision, they're going to stick to it, right or wrong. That's because he can't imagine anything else. He can't imagine a way out of his own mistakes, as well, right?
Right, and I think that imagination was the key thing in the leaders of our first generation.
They had to, right? Because you were building from
Yeah,
scratch,
yeah.
right? In a way, building from scratch. So you had to think up all sorts of strange, theretofore unthought of solutions, perhaps, right? And then you had to strategize. Now, when we read about in detail anyway, not the official textbooks, you read in history books and in original texts about the process that we went through towards gaining independence. A lot of strategizing went on. And that could be done only because these leaders knew their enemy. They knew how the British worked. They knew the good and bad points of the British system. They knew who to talk to. They need, all that takes a lot of work. Not only that, all that needs a lot of collaboration among the leaders themselves, right?
Yeah.
You do this, I'll do that, that kind of thing. So if you read about that period, you could see that there was, luckily for us to some extent, that kind of commonality in many of the leaders. I'm not trying to play down the conflicts that were built into the system. Leaders fight, of course. But then you do see that there is a goal to what they're doing.
Yeah.
And if you don't have that goal and you're in a leadership position, then you'll be wondering, why am I a leader? It must be for my own material gain. Everyone thinks I'm wonderful. I must be wonderful. Everyone kisses my hand. My hand must be fragrant, and so on and so forth, right? Because you have forgotten the reason you're there and who you're responsible to, right? Now, one last point perhaps I should make that Tun Dr. Ismail did make very often, and to his son Taufik quite often, was that if you want to be a politician, you get a career first. Then you become a politician. Otherwise, you're going to have politics as your career, and that is not what politics is about. That is not what political leadership is about. So in his case, of course, he was
already a doctor.
He was a doctor, and he didn't need the political money
exactly
to survive.
So people shouldn't, be a politician for the money, of course, in the first place. But you're saying that, you're saying that
I don't think it can be the case for everybody. I'm sure, because the parties, democracy is about the battles between parties, and our type of democracy anyway. And so the party system would have its own career, but I think it's become too much of that. So you join politics to become rich. You join politics to have a career. It's not. I wouldn't, in all cases, say that's wrong. That would be, the world doesn't look like that. But it shouldn't. The other side shouldn't be forgotten.
Okay. Yeah.
Right. Otherwise, I think you're going to have a government that has very little technocracy in it. Now, technocracy, I think, is also a bad word in some sense. But I think if we talk about politicians on one side, bureaucrats on another side, and technocrats on the other side, I think you have to work out a good balance between these. What has happened in Malaysian politics, I think, since we privatized according to Reagan and Thatcher's way of thinking, what we have now is a highly bureaucratized government run by populist politicians and supported by very few technocrats. That's what's one of the faults of Malaysian nation building at the moment. We need to get the academics, the technocrats, and their contribution back into the running Malaysian of government. Politics. Because the running of government is not only politics, it's technical in many, many ways, like any organization. Yeah. If you take away the technical part, then what have you got?
Then there's nothing left.
Then you just have bureaucrats and politicians running the place. And I think we have too much of that. I think you would agree.
Yeah, totally agree. Thank you, Kee Beng, so much for speaking with me today. I've been speaking to Dr. Ooi Kee Beng, Executive Director of Penang Institute and the author of the award-winning The Reluctant Politician, Tun Dr. Ismail and His Time. This is Spill the Tea, a podcast by Penang Institute.